June 10, 1944. Normandy, France. The air still smelled of cordite and wet soil. Just beyond the shattered hedgerows, a line of exhausted men trudged along a dirt road, their hands raised, helmets dangling, eyes fixed on the ground. German prisoners. Wehrmacht troops from the 352nd Infantry Division, captured near St. Lo after 2 days of desperate fighting. Rain had turned the earth into sludge. Boots sank with every step. Somewhere in the distance, a jeep backfired, and every German flinched. Private Karl Mahler, 21 years old, stared at the boots of the man in front of him. He hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. His bread ration had molded in the damp. His canteen was nearly empty. Around his neck, the dog tag glinted dully beneath a crust of mud. Then, the column halted. Ahead, a group of American MPs stood beside a sign scrawled in chalk on a plank of wood. POW Collection Point, 29th Infantry Division. The Americans didn't shout. They didn't sneer. They just pointed, calm, efficient, detached. Karl noticed their uniforms were clean. Not spotless, but well kept. And they looked healthy. Well fed. That struck him harder than the loss itself. As the prisoners were herded behind barbed wire, he caught the smell of something he hadn't encountered since before the war: cooking meat. Real meat. Somewhere nearby, American soldiers were eating lunch. He turned his head, trying to see. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he glimpsed a mess tent, olive drab and billowing in the breeze. GIs lined up with metal trays, steam rising from them. On the tables, eggs, thick slabs of bacon, and something that gleamed like dark glass. Bottles. It wasn't schnapps. It was Coca-Cola. Karl blinked. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. One of the MPs noticed him staring and smirked. "Don't worry, Fritz," he said, his accent broad and easy. "You'll get your turn." The words weren't cruel. Just matter-of-fact. Karl looked back at his comrades, hollow faces, eyes wide. The realization spread among them like static. These weren't starving, desperate enemies scraping by on half rations. These men could afford to feed prisoners well. That was the first crack, the first moment when the myth of German superiority began to crumble. But what they didn't yet understand was this. What they saw in that muddy French field was only a glimpse of the machine behind it all, an industrial miracle that stretched from Iowa to the English Channel, from factory floors to floating kitchens. The Americans weren't just fighting with guns. They were fighting with food. And for the Germans who lived on black bread and horse meat, that realization was about to hit like a bombshell. The next morning, the sun rose pale and colorless through the Normandy mist. Dew clung to the barbed wire like frost. Inside the makeshift POW camp, German soldiers stirred, wrapped in thin blankets, shivering in their field-gray uniforms. Private Karl Mahler sat up as a faint sound drifted from beyond the wire. It wasn't gunfire or engines. It was laughter. He turned his head, and there they were again. The Americans. They moved with the rhythm of a well-rehearsed routine. Trucks pulled up in columns, their canvas flaps open, crates stacked like bricks of treasure. Men in aprons unloaded the cargo, cans of beans, flour sacks, boxes stamped. U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. A mobile kitchen hissed and clattered, pots steaming, metal spoons stirring something thick and rich. The smell of bacon and coffee hung in the air. Karl's stomach twisted. He could almost taste it. The Americans joked as they worked, a kind of easy confidence, the kind that comes when a man doesn't have to worry about his next meal. He glanced at his comrade, Oberstfighter Hans Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front. Hans muttered under his breath, "Unmöglich, how can they live like this here?" Karl didn't answer. He just watched. A young GI, maybe 19, poured himself a mug of coffee, black as oil. Then he unwrapped a bar of chocolate, broke it in half, and handed a piece through the fence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Karl reached out and took it. It melted instantly on his tongue. Sweet. Smooth. American. Hans stared. "Chocolate," he whispered. "In a war zone." But what the prisoners couldn't see was the miracle behind that chocolate, a global web of factories, ships, and railways that made it possible. Back in the United States, entire cities were working around the clock to feed the army. Chicago packed 10 million cans of meat per week. Kansas sent wheat by the ton. Hershey engineers had invented a special high-calorie chocolate bar that wouldn't melt in the desert or freeze in the Arctic, a marvel of chemistry wrapped in wax paper. The Quartermaster Corps didn't just supply, it anticipated. They calculated the caloric needs of a man under fire, adjusted menus for climate, shipped powdered milk to the Pacific, dehydrated eggs for Europe, and even sent mobile ice cream plants to keep morale high. For every rifle on the front, there were 20 men behind it, driving trucks, repairing engines, cooking meals, typing manifests. Logistics wasn't glamorous, but it was victory made visible. To the Germans, who were used to scraping for fuel and stretching bread into sawdust, it was unthinkable. As the day went on, the POWs were given their rations: white bread, beans, and, to their astonishment, meat. Fresh meat. Karl hesitated before eating, looking at the label stamped on the tin. Packed by Swift and Company, Chicago. He didn't know where Chicago was. But he knew what it meant. America was fighting with factories. That night, as the camp quieted, he whispered to Hans, "If they can feed us like this, what must they feed their own?" Hans didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside the wire, trucks still rolled through the darkness, headlights dimmed. Each one carried a taste of home for the men in olive drab. And for the Germans, watching from behind the fence, it was a taste of something else entirely. The realization that they had never stood a chance against a nation that could feed its army like this. But the most shocking moment was still to come, a sight that would erase any last illusion of parity. 3 days later, the prisoners heard it before they saw it, the low growl of engines rolling through the dawn fog. At first, Karl thought it was another supply column, maybe ammunition or fuel. But as the trucks came into view, even the guards turned their heads. These weren't ordinary supply trucks. They were painted in the same olive drab, yes, but stenciled across their sides, in bold white letters, was a name that no German soldier could have expected to see in the middle of a war zone. Coca-Cola. The convoy rumbled to a halt beside the American camp kitchens. Soldiers jumped out, unloading wooden crates filled with glass bottles. The hiss of carbonation and the clinking of glass filled the morning air. The sound was alien and strangely cheerful. Karl and Hans pressed closer to the fence, silent. They watched as the Americans distributed bottles to the men coming off patrol, each soldier twisting off a cap and taking a long, cold drink straight from the bottle. Some poured it over tin cups filled with ice, laughing as the fizz rose up and spilled onto their gloves. Ice. In a war. Karl's lips parted. He couldn't help himself. It looked like a dream. One of the guards, a corporal with a crooked grin, noticed the German staring and held up his bottle. "Not bad, huh?" he said. "We got bottling plants running right here in France now. Fresh batch every week." He tapped the label. "Same stuff we get back home." The POWs exchanged glances. A few whispered among themselves. Hans shook his head slowly. "They're bottling soda in a war zone?" Karl didn't answer. His mind was trying to make sense of it. The Wehrmacht couldn't even get enough gasoline to move its tanks. Bread was rationed down to crusts, and ersatz coffee was brewed from burnt barley. Back home, civilians traded cigarettes for sugar, saving every crumb. And here, the Americans had factories making Coca-Cola on the front line. That wasn't just comfort. It was symbolism. To the Germans, food had always been tied to discipline and sacrifice. To the Americans, it was about abundance, proof that their industry could create luxury even in chaos. Coca-Cola was morale bottled up, a taste of home, a reminder that their country had enough power to make sweetness flow through war. And the system behind it was astonishing. By 1943, Coca-Cola had pledged to supply every American serviceman with a bottle of Coke, 5 cents, anywhere in the world. The U.S. Army helped build bottling plants across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, each one staffed by soldiers and civilians working under military logistics. Each bottle required glass, sugar, carbonation, and shipping space that could have been used for bullets. Yet generals approved it, because they knew morale could win wars as surely as firepower. For Karl, that revelation was overwhelming. He watched as a GI wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and tossed the empty bottle into a pile. It clinked among dozens of others. Wasteful. Effortless. The sound echoed in his chest. It wasn't just that America was rich. It was that America could afford to be generous. He remembered the words of his company sergeant back in Normandy, before their surrender. Our enemies are soft. They cannot endure hardship. But looking at those soldiers, drinking soda after victory, he realized how wrong that was. They didn't need to endure hunger. They had outbuilt it. The American war machine wasn't fueled by ideology. It was fueled by logistics, by breakfast, by steak, by ice-cold Coke. And soon, the Germans would see the full extent of that machine, the floating kitchens, the mobile bakeries, the rolling ice cream factories that followed the GIs like shadows. Karl would never forget the first time he saw one. It was July 1944 when the next revelation came, not from the land, but from the sea. The prisoners had been moved north, near Cherbourg, to assist with unloading captured material under Allied supervision. From behind a cordon of barbed wire and MPs, Karl and the others could see the harbor, choked with ships, cranes, and landing craft. At first, it looked like chaos. But there was a rhythm to it, a pulse. Dozens of Liberty ships offloading supplies around the clock. Crates of ammunition, fuel drums, medical kits. And then, food. Karl shaded his eyes against the glare. One of the ships wasn't like the others. It had no guns on deck. Instead, he saw smoke rising from tall vents and men in aprons working amid the stacks of cargo. It wasn't a troop ship. It was a kitchen. A massive floating kitchen. Aboard that vessel, the U.S. Navy's Floating Field Bakery Unit No. 1 was baking thousands of loaves a day. Rows of ovens lined the decks, powered by portable boilers. The bread was transferred into trucks that rolled straight to the front lines. The smell reached even the POW camp, warm, yeasty, almost painfully familiar. Karl inhaled deeply. He hadn't smelled fresh bread since his mother's kitchen in Bremen. Hans spoke softly, as if afraid to break the spell. They bake bread on ships. Karl nodded slowly. They bring the bakery to the war. A nearby American sergeant overheard and grinned. That's right, Fritz. You boys keep fighting with crumbs, we'll fight with sandwiches. The men around Karl laughed under their breath. Not mockery, disbelief. They didn't even have words for it. But the Americans didn't stop there. Each Liberty ship was part of a grand choreography of supply, connected by floating pipelines, prefabricated harbors, and fleets of trucks that rolled day and night. Inside one nearby warehouse, Karl glimpsed rows of refrigeration units humming softly. When the doors opened, the cold air spilled out, revealing stacks of frozen meat, milk, and butter. They weren't just feeding an army, they were recreating a civilization on foreign soil. And among all this abundance, a small truck rumbled past painted with curious letters. U.S. Navy, Ice Cream Unit. Karl blinked. He thought it was a joke. But it wasn't. The Americans had developed mobile ice cream factories, complete with compressors and mixers, capable of producing hundreds of gallons a day. They served it to wounded soldiers recovering in field hospitals. Ice cream. At war. For the Germans, it was beyond comprehension. Back home, children scraped ration cards for powdered milk. Here, soldiers dipped spoons into vanilla and chocolate, smiling through the dirt of battle. Hans muttered, "They live as if the war doesn't touch them." But Karl saw deeper. No, the war did touch them. But it didn't break them. Their abundance was their armor. The United States had transformed food into a weapon of morale, logistics, and psychology. Every warm meal was a reminder to its soldiers, you are cared for, you will not go hungry, you are winning. And for the prisoners watching from the wire, that truth burned harder than hunger. Still, Karl couldn't stop wondering. How could a nation so young, so far away, sustained such luxury in war? The answer, he would soon learn, wasn't just about machines or factories. It was about people, millions of ordinary Americans who never saw the front but fought in their own way. The cooks, the canners, the factory girls. The invisible army. Back in the United States, the war was fought not with rifles or tanks, but with ladles, conveyor belts, and grease-stained aprons. Towns that once slept quietly beneath water towers and church bells had transformed into industrial front lines. In places like Chicago, Omaha, and Pittsburgh, factory whistles replaced bugles. Millions of men were overseas, and in their place, women filled the assembly lines. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just riveting anymore. She was canning beans, welding ship ovens, packing powdered milk, and printing menus for the 8th Army. In one sprawling facility outside Springfield, Missouri, workers produced over 1.6 million field rations per day. Every box was stamped Meal Combat Type C, a code for nutrition, efficiency, and survival. Each can inside those boxes had been calculated to deliver the exact calories a soldier needed to march, fight, and stay sane. The beans had to heat evenly in the field. The meat had to last for months. Even the coffee, dehydrated, vacuum-sealed, instant, was engineered for endurance. These were the invisible victories. A waitress in Kansas City swapped her apron for a hairnet, sealing tins of Spam bound for the South Pacific. A farmer in Iowa plowed long after sunset, his tractor's light cutting through the night like a beacon. A teenage girl in Detroit worked the night shift assembling stoves for field kitchens, her pay envelope marked "For the boys." Together they formed a second front, one that fed the first. And America's logistical genius wasn't just its scale, it was its speed. Within 48 hours of a division's landing in Normandy, mobile kitchens were cooking hot meals from ingredients that had been on U.S. soil less than 2 weeks before. By the time the front lines moved inland, the supply network had already leapfrogged ahead, laying fresh tracks, new warehouses, and refrigeration units to keep the army fed. When General Eisenhower called logistics the supreme art of war, this was what he meant. Meanwhile, in Germany, factories were burning. Rail lines were collapsing. Families rationed bread and horse meat while the Wehrmacht begged for fuel. To the men like Karl Mahler, captured now and watching from behind wire, this unseen American machine became something mythic, a force as vast as the ocean itself. One evening, as the POWs sat under the dim light of the camp flood lamps, Karl spoke quietly to Hans. "My father used to say we Germans have discipline," he murmured. "But this is something else." Hans nodded slowly. "Discipline without hunger." Karl looked at the glowing horizon where the harbor cranes still moved through the night. "Maybe that's what real power looks like." That night he dreamed of home, of his mother slicing bread thinner every month, of empty shelves, of cold kitchens. When he woke the next morning, the Americans were already eating breakfast, eggs frying, coffee boiling, laughter echoing through the mist. For the first time, Karl didn't feel anger. He felt awe. But that awe was about to turn into something deeper, something almost haunting. Because what came next wasn't just comfort, it was confrontation. Soon, Karl and the other prisoners would be transferred across the ocean. To America itself. And there they would see with their own eyes what no propaganda could ever prepare them for. October 1944. The Atlantic roared like a living thing. The transport ship USAT George Washington cut through the dark water, her decks slick with salt spray and wind. Below, hundreds of German prisoners huddled in silence, tired, gaunt, but alive. Among them sat Karl Mahler and Hans Richter, clutching their wool coats tight against the chill. They didn't know exactly where they were going. Rumors whispered through the hold, a camp somewhere in the American heartland. Wide fields. Hot food. Clean beds. The stories sounded too generous to be true. But when they disembarked weeks later at Camp Swift, Texas, they learned the truth was stranger than rumor. The first thing Karl noticed was the smell: warm earth, grass, and coffee. Not the bitterness of battle, but the scent of peace. Rows of wooden barracks stretched into the horizon, surrounded by farmland. The guards weren't cruel or paranoid. They smiled. Some even waved. Within an hour, the prisoners were handed soap, towels, and clean clothes. By evening, they were fed hot stew, fresh bread, real butter, and unbelievably, apple pie. Karl held the plate in disbelief. The slice of pie steamed in the cool night air, cinnamon and sugar melting together. He glanced at Hans, who stared down at his own meal like it might vanish. A guard noticed their hesitation. "Eat," he said with a grin. "There's plenty more where that came from." Plenty more. For German soldiers who'd lived through years of rationing, those words carried the weight of a miracle. That night, after lights out, Karl lay awake in the barracks listening to the crickets outside. He could hear faint laughter drifting from the guards' canteen, the clink of bottles, the hum of a jukebox. Somewhere out there, men who had defeated him were eating well, drinking well, and dancing. And for the first time, he didn't feel resentment. He felt wonder. Days passed, and Karl began to see what America truly was, a land where abundance seemed to spill over. Every morning, trains arrived with supplies: flour, meat, vegetables, crates of milk bottles, sacks of sugar. Trucks delivered newspapers, fruit, even baseballs for the camp's rec field. The food wasn't just sustenance. It was strategy. American officials believed that feeding POWs well would break the poison of Nazi propaganda, to show them that democracy wasn't weakness, but strength. That freedom could feed millions while tyranny starved its own. It worked. Each meal was a lesson in industrial might and moral contrast. Karl began working in the camp's kitchen, scrubbing pots and cleaning tables. One day, a sergeant handed him a mug of cold milk. "Straight from the dairy this morning," he said. Karl took a sip. It was rich, clean, alive, a taste he hadn't known since before the war. He realized then that the Americans' real weapon wasn't their tanks or bombers. It was their ability to make even their prisoners feel human again. By the time the war ended, over 370,000 German POWs had lived in camps across the United States. Many would later write home, describing their shock, not at cruelty, but at kindness. Letters smuggled past censors spoke of unbelievable food, endless coffee, and enemies who smiled. For men raised to believe America was decadent and weak, it was the final undoing of a myth. In a way, the war had ended for them not with a bullet, but with a meal. As Karl finished washing dishes one evening, he stood outside the mess hall watching the sun set over the Texas plains, orange lights spilling across endless land. He thought of his comrades still fighting in the ruins of Europe. He whispered softly to himself, "They never stood a chance." Because now he understood, behind every American soldier was a kitchen, a truck, a factory, a nation that believed in plenty. The real victory had been baked, bottled, and boiled, long before it was ever won on the battlefield.